Morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you're joining us from today. My name is Vivian Onano. I am a Kenyan and a Concordia Africa advisor, among many other hats that I do wear. I am truly humbled and excited to be moderating today's strategic dialogue roundtable discussion on regional response and economic recovery focused on Africa. This will continue to be an ongoing discussion leading up to the Concordia Africa Initiative Summit on the 16th and 17th November through the partnership with the Rwandan Development Board. I am joined by an esteemed set of panelists from across the African continent and beyond. These are leaders that I look up to in very many ways, and it's an honor to be able to engage with them today on such a timely discussion. So I'll go ahead and introduce our panelists today. So first, we have the Prime Minister of Cape Verde, His Excellency José Ulisses Correia e Silva. His Excellency is the 5th Prime Minister of the Republic of Cape Verde and also the President of Movement for Democracy, MPD, the country's majority party. Through his previous tenure as the Mayor of Praia, Cape Verde's largest city and capital, and now as the Prime Minister, he continues to be a staunch advocate for economic growth and political reforms. Second, we're joined by His Excellency, former President of Nigeria, Olusegun Obasanjo, also famously known as Baba. His Excellency was the President of Nigeria, Africa's most populous nation from 1999 to 2007. He oversaw his country's first power and administrative reforms that accelerated economic growth. He has been involved in so many initiatives on the continent and globally focused on economic reforms, governance, development, peace and security, among others. He's also a Concordia Leadership Council member. Third, we are joined by Her Excellency, the First Lady of Namibia, Mrs. Monica Geingos, who also happens to be a very dear friend. And for the past 4 years, we've actually shared a panel at UNGA, and this year is no different. Her Excellency is a qualified lawyer who spent 15 years of her professional career as a private equity and governance expert before becoming the First Lady in 2015. She has served on the boards of large public and private sector companies as either the chairperson or deputy chairperson. She's a great advocate for young people and has a deep passion for enterprise development focused on youth entrepreneurship and the integration of rural and urban economies. She's also the founder and executive director of One Economy Foundation. She's a Concordia Leadership Council member. Next, we're joined by Ms. Clare Akamanzi, Chief Executive Officer of the Rwandan Development Board and member of the Cabinet of Rwanda. She previously served as Head of Strategy and Policy for His Excellency, President Paul Kagame. She's an international trade and investment lawyer. She's a 2012 Young Global Leader for the World Economic Forum and was named one of the Africa's top 20 leading women in economic development by Forbes in 2013. Next, we're joined by Dr. James Mwangi, Group CEO of Equity Group Holdings, another dear friend of mine. Dr. Mwangi is one of Africa's most renowned thought leaders, a disruptive entrepreneur and philanthropist. Dr. Mwangi has received numerous global awards for his outstanding work, with the most recent one being the winner of the 2020 Oslo Business for Peace Award. Congratulations, Dr. Mwangi. He's also the chairman of the Health Committee of Kenya COVID-19 Fund. Next, we are joined by Dr. Tsitsi Masiyiwa, a renowned African philanthropist and social entrepreneur, another good friend. She's the executive chair and co-founder of High Life Foundation, whose primary goal is to invest in human capital development to build thriving individuals, communities, and sustainable livelihoods. Dr. Tsitsi is also an advisor and thought partner to universities, national leaders, and social entrepreneurs on issues of education, leadership development, and youth empowerment. I'm looking forward to hearing on your contribution there, regarding the education disruption and the work that you're doing with young entrepreneurs who have been greatly impacted by this pandemic. Next, we have Mr. Alain Ebobisse, Chief Executive Officer of Africa 50, the Pan-African Infrastructure Investment Platform capitalized by the African Development Bank and over 20 African countries and central banks. Prior to this role, He was the global head for the World Bank Group's Global Infrastructure Project Development Fund, overseeing investment in numerous infrastructure projects in Africa, Asia, Europe, and Latin America. Last but not least, we have Ms. Kate Wilson, Chief Executive Officer of Digital Impact Alliance at the UN Foundation. She believes that digital technology products, new technology policies, and updated business model practices are required to make transformative change in the lives of the underserved and decrease the growing digital. Kate has worked both in the private and nonprofit sectors in over 18 countries globally. So welcome again to my esteemed panelists. So today's conversation, it's a conversation among yourselves, and I hope that you can engage, ask questions, contribute to each other's remarks, agree to disagree. And my role as a moderator is just to make sure that we keep to the time allocated for us. But all the work is up to you as the panelists. So COVID-19 has disrupted economies worldwide, but the potential loss of these past decades' gains across Africa will have a devastating impact on not only national and regional economies, but the global recovery as a whole. Africa is expected to experience a contraction in economic growth, resulting in output losses between 37 and 79 billion. So to start our conversation, the current state of the sub-Saharan Africa economy, what unique characteristics regarding its economy and labor force have contributed to the scale of economic impact brought by COVID-19? And I'll ask Dr. Mwangi to please start off the conversation. Oh, sorry, Dr. Mwangi, I think you're muted.
Thank you very much, Vivian. And truly, Africa has been significantly affected by COVID-19. The four main characteristics that has brought that to fore. One is the structure of our economies, and particularly the size of our informal sector, which was ill-prepared to adequately respond or to be supported. That truly, with majority of the economies having up to 90% of their economies being in the informal sector, adversely affected response rate. And two, the informal sector was badly affected by mitigation measures that were put into place. The second one was the physical space that most of the African countries had. And essentially, with most of the countries having debt to GDP ratios of up to 60%, they had very limited space to be able to execute stimulus packages that were significant enough to protect lives and livelihoods of the citizens. The third reason was the high dependence on primary commodities and non-diversified economies. Most of African economies rely on one or two commodities, primary level, without the processing capability. And in the process, once those were disrupted, significant inflows to the African countries was affected. And fourth, but not least, is the fragile nature of our health systems. They were fragile, they were weak, and so consequently, the governments across the continent had to put massive resources at the expense of everything else to really fortify the first line of defense, a working health system. And you look at some countries, they had to put up to 20, 30,000 bed capacity in their health infrastructure. And that, of course, took enormous resources, leaving the governments without significant resources to address the other thing. I would put those four as the shared reasons why across the continent, the response, particularly in GDP, has been quite fragile.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mwangi, for the input. I'll go to the Prime Minister of Cape Verde. His Excellency, what do you think are the most pressing issues that we need to address based on what Dr. Mwangi has shared?
Good morning. So thank you for the invitation. In the context of COVID-19 pandemic, I would like to introduce two key issues. First of all, access of the vaccine, and second, debt forgiveness. COVID-19 vaccine must be universal and recognized as an essential public good. Special consideration must be given for the foreign debt of developing nations. We know that few countries in the world have the resource to absorb the extraordinary costs of management the pandemic, let alone recovering and relaunching their economies. Whereas countries approach the pandemic with the financial bazookas, whereas most African nations have only arrows. The financial bazooka for Africa countries, the forgiveness of foreign debt. But we think that forgiveness does far more than alleviate crushing immediate pressures. It is a turning point to drive sustainable development and the framework of the SDGs, and particularly those relevant to peace, good governance, sustainable management of resources, poverty reduction, and decent job creation for young people. And I will head the diversifying of the economy. The proposal that we think is to transform the debt into investment to reach the SDGs. I'd like to talk about the case of Cabo Verde. We have made the commitment to apply any debt relief to finance our 2030 strategic agenda for development, sustainable development. And we have key priorities that are human capital development, the main resource we have, public health security, digital transformation, energy transition, water strategy for agriculture associated with renewable energies, the development of bioeconomy and sustainable tourism. There are the key priorities for us to be more stronger in terms of resilience and diversify our economy in the context post COVID-19.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, for your contribution. I would like to head to Ms. Clare Akamanzi. Clare, you've had His Excellency's contribution on what are some of the most pressing issues to address, and he's talked about the vaccine and also debt forgiveness. Do you think these are the pressing issues that need to be addressed, or what do you think from your end as the CEO of the Rwandan Development Board?
Thank you very much, Vivian, and it's such a pleasure to see these distinguished panelists, many of whom are friends engaging this afternoon. Very nice to see you all. I think for Rwanda, you know, the pandemic gave very strong shocks, both on the demand and supply side. And so for me, as the Rwanda Development Board, as Rwanda, is also very much looking at how do we address the impact that has been both from a demand, so really affecting jobs, affecting spending capacity, but also on the supply side, disrupting production, you know, making it very difficult for supply chains to be sustained. So for us, the key thing is how do you really put in place programs or issues that can actually address both the demand and supply side? And the way we've approached it in Rwanda is really putting in place an economic recovery plan that looks at how do you create more job opportunities, where are those opportunities that you can actually create large numbers of jobs. And again, very much in line with what Dr. Mwangi said in terms of what the key impact has been. If you look at the structure of jobs in Rwanda, it's very much those kinds of jobs that require physical presence. So it's either subsistence agriculture or it's blue collar jobs like construction, transportation, things that actually require physical space for you to supply the activity. And so with the pandemic and the lockdowns, that really affected those kinds of jobs. So how do you put in place reforms that actually address going back to work as quickly as possible, and which sectors those are? So for us, we've selected a few sectors like manufacturing. We are supporting agriculture as one of the key sectors for the economic recovery plan. So really looking at that on the job side. But also, how do you bring activities of production to really go back as much as possible? So we put in place this economic recovery fund of $100 million that is looking at supporting businesses that have been affected and their domestic production affected to apply for a restructuring of their loans, but also working capital so that they can go back and start financing the businesses as much as possible and really trying to address the key sectors that have been affected. So for us, it's tourism, it's trade, it's manufacturing as the key sectors that we are addressing that have been affected. So that's really how we are approaching it in Rwanda.
Thank you so much, Claire. You've raised some key points there also when it comes to jobs, and I would like to bring in Dr. Tsitsi Masiyiwa because young people and women have been greatly impacted when it comes to loss of jobs. They're the majority in the informal sectors, and they are the majority also who are employed by some of these SMEs that have sort of been washed away since the pandemic started. So Dr. Tsitsi, so what are some of the challenges that you've seen with some of the entrepreneurs that you've been working with, most of the young people and women in particular, and how have you been able to help them since the pandemic started?
Thank you, Vivian. I must say it's the issues that the other speakers have articulated are common across the whole continent. It's a description of every single of the African countries. But with regard to young people and entrepreneurship, what has made the situation even more pressing is the problems existed before COVID. So I want to hasten to say the problems are not because of COVID. They have just been made worse. They've been worsened or amplified by COVID. And what we have seen is because of restrictions to movement, inability to cross border because of most of the, for example, where Zimbabwe, where I come from, Zimbabweans are very much dependent on cross-border trade with South Africa. We do a lot with Botswana, Zambia. So that movement being curtailed has had adverse impact. In addition to that, internal restrictions, which were based, I think, more on just because nobody really knew what COVID was, and less about strategic decisions that really would have an impact in lessening the impact of COVID. The fear factor also just worsened the situation of our entrepreneurs. So what we primarily did was, first of all, to make sure that we communicated and explained what the problem was before we tried to solve the problems that are peculiar to entrepreneurs. So it was to have a very robust and wide drive in informing people so that you dispel fears of what COVID is and what it's not. You can imagine the level of anxiety, national and international anxiety that hang over the heads of decision makers, plus our entrepreneurs and our most vulnerable in our communities. So the information drive, speaking to people, explaining what COVID is, what it's not, how you get it, how you prevent it was extremely paramount. And then the next level was to look at what is the low-hanging fruit that we can tackle in order to begin to some extent, to rebuild confidence. And we did that by identifying opportunities in agriculture because of food security challenges that people generally face. Majority of the entrepreneurs live from hand to mouth. They don't have savings. So it was, what are some of the investments we can make? So we've invested a lot in training in agriculture to stimulate food production. And we've also encouraged a lot of our entrepreneurs to pivot and to see opportunities more in in industries like chicken, raising chickens and growing food for day-to-day consumption, like your vegetables and products that require less use of water and minimal technology. So at the moment, it's really been, where's the low-hanging fruit? Where are the opportunities? Where can we make investments where the costs are low, but the impact is great? And that's how those are some of the issues that have really driven the type of investment we have made in entrepreneurship. Thank you.
Fantastic. And I'd just like to bring in another question. One of the countries that you work in is Zimbabwe. And apart from COVID, we also have political unrest to some level in Zimbabwe. So how do you reach the young people in the rural and marginalized areas? Because during such times, it's always like much easier to reach the people neck adjacent to you, but we tend to forget those people who are in the marginalized and rural areas that actually need more of these supports. So how have you been able to reach out to those? Because I think apart from pandemic and also having political unrest, you can just imagine how many people can be left behind by the system because of the ongoing unrest.
So one of the ways in which we structured our organization is to be very decentralized at a national level. So we have, and our offices are embedded within communities. So what we've done was to reach out to the communities, and we had a massive education campaign where we trained community leaders to go out, identify where the most vulnerable people were while they were educating communities on COVID. So we're able to identify old people who had no access to food, the disabled. We organized food packs and quickly distributed them into the communities. We also used radio a lot to educate, to find out where the needs are, and create a channel of communication to identify quickly where the vulnerable are and get information and be able to respond.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing. I know during these challenging times, it's really important for us to remember those who are in the marginalized areas to make sure that nobody's left behind, because most of the time they're the ones who tend to be forgotten. I would like to move to the Her Excellency, the First Lady of Namibia, Madam Geingos. As a passionate, for your passion for enterprise development, focused on youth entrepreneurship and the integration of rural and urban economies through your work as the founder and director of One Economy Foundation. So what are some of the issues that have been exacerbated by COVID-19, and what are some of the structural reforms that could help avoid future ripple effects? Because you're working with both the urban and rural economy, it will be really interesting to get your perspective on that.
I think that answer's got a lot to do what Tsitsi just mentioned, that COVID, it really became a mirror which reflected existing problems, and it walked along pre-existing fault lines. So the solutions are very much the solutions we've been talking about for a long time, and it created its new problems as well. And I want to pick up a comment that was made by Dr. Mwangi when he spoke about the already burdened fiscal space pre-COVID. And Namibia certainly is a testament to that, because we already had a 2-year recession. We were coming out of a drought. We're dealing with hepatitis E outbreaks. So our fiscal space was certainly already under significant pressure. Our budgets are done in February every year. By February, the impact and the extent of spread of COVID wasn't significant. So you can imagine we need a national reprioritization of our national budgets as a matter of urgency. The health ministry has probably blown through a significant portion of its budgets, and it's in the context of a fiscal space that doesn't have the ability to do more than what it's currently doing. So we need to do better with what we have. We need to really look at collaboration, both interministerial, international partners who are already on the ground, whether it's philanthropic organizations, whether it's the private sector. I think collaboration is going to be the key there. And also to keep a mindful eye on the issues, because there's a multiplier effect to everything, and to keep a watchful eye on secondary pandemics like gender-based violence. We're talking, for instance, about the health sector and the condition that we found it in, but we're not talking enough about the disruption of health services. As we deploy in finances and personnel to focus on COVID, we're looking at maternal health metrics that are significantly declining, family planning, the accessibility of contraceptives. A lot of that's got to do with human resources. Some of it has got to do with global supply chains that have collapsed, and we can't procure what we need. And if we can, it's at significantly higher prices. I'd like to add to what Dr. Mwangi talked about, the fragile nature of health, and just add education there, and specifically highlight issues around mental health. I think that's a second epidemic that we're going to deal with. And then also just look again on the financial part. Vivian, I was reading an article 2 days ago that Zambia has announced that they cannot pay the interest on their US dollar denominated debt notes. And I'm quite sure the likes of Namibia being part of SADC, we're going to see an uptick on our default rates going up, because now Zambia can't pay their bond notes. We've got the same kind of fiscal problem. We can't afford the cost of capital to become higher for us, because we are going to go out into international debt markets to borrow. And that's linking into the point that the Prime Minister made about debt forgiveness. Obviously, not every country will qualify for debt forgiveness, but those who do should get it, because their default on their loan obligations has an impact on every single country within the region. So I think the nice thing about speaking almost last is I get to really agree with what Claire said, with James, with Tsitsi. And I hope you don't mind me calling you on your first name, because I insist to be called on my first name. My first name is Monica, not Your Excellency. Vivian, you know this. So they say that pandemics, they show us who we are. So whatever we're seeing is who we were before the pandemic, and hopefully the picture will look better post-pandemic, because if there was ever an opportunity for us to set the reset button, it's now. So the solutions to youth have been given by Tsitsi already. And I just want to agree with everything she said, and just underline the issues around mental health as well. I think we've had mixed messaging to young people, where we've convinced them that the pandemic doesn't really affect them as much, because they are healthier, they don't have as many comorbidities as others, and that their mortality rates are lower. But the reality is they are most affected by the indirect consequences of COVID, whether it's around those who are dropping out of school and never returning, whether it's teenage pregnancies, whether it's exposure to harm, whether it's mental health issues, whether it's funding challenges for their businesses and for their education. I think young people are most affected. And there was a question there, what do we need to focus on the most? And my answer is, there isn't one thing. I think Claire mentioned a number of things that were very important, including the agriculture sector. And I think the way I like to look at things as a mother, the biggest decisions I've made as a mother have evolved around my children, which country I work in, the neighborhood I live in, the promotions I accept or don't accept, the decisions I make about whether to remain married or to divorce. It had to do with the welfare of my kids. And I think societies, communities, governments, we probably need to center children and look at everything we want to do in relation to the response to COVID around children and youth, because there's going to be multi-generational implications to many of the problems we're seeing now. So deal with the immediate problems as well as the long-term problems that we know are going to happen. And the best way to focus our minds correctly is to think what is in the best interest of the child.
Thank you so much, Her Excellency. Thank you so much, Her Excellency, for your contribution. As you said, pandemic shows us who we are, and we should figure out how to come out better and have a better picture. So I turn to Mr. Alain Ebobisse. How do we come out better? What do we need to do? And what kind of partnerships do we need to come up with, both regionally, internationally, because your work involves a lot of partnerships?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I extremely pleased and honored to be joining this very important conversation with very, very distinguished speaker. I think, you know, as everybody said, the pandemic has really affected us in an unprecedented way. The growth, unemployment, disrupted lives, etc. But if you allow me, I'd like to focus on infrastructure, which is the mandate of Africa 50, the organization that I lead. The crisis has highlighted the need for sustainable infrastructure that puts the human first, but also helps build resilient economies. This is very important. Now, even before COVID-19, we needed massive investments in Africa to close the infrastructure gap. Some figures by the FDB quote the investment gap as high as $100 billion a year. So closing this gap has become even more urgent with the health crisis, especially with respect to health infrastructure. Therefore, I think the first observation that I want to make is that any post-pandemic stimulus plan should include a substantial infrastructure component. That's my opinion, because infrastructure is a growth catalyst with a high multiplier effect. It facilitates trades, improves mobilities, employment opportunities, a lot of things, good things that comes from infrastructure investment. Now, we should also say that because everybody has talked about it, this is a common theme, because of the limited fiscal space, government funding is insufficient to really to make a massive infrastructure play. So the participation of the private sector is extremely essential, in my opinion. Now, yes, the challenge that we have is that the pandemic has created a big capital flight away from emerging market. It's not only Africa, it's global emerging market, globally flight to safety. And so we see today governments in our continent, they have somewhat difficulties to borrow. Her Excellency, I dare call her Monica because she allowed us to do so. She mentioned the case of Zambia. Indeed, this is an issue, and we will see a lot of strain on government finances. So we need to figure out a way to reverse that capital flight. I think this is going to be very, very, very critically important for Africa's economic reversal. Now, at Africa 50, we've been promoting one idea that basically would help government to raise cash without increasing their debt. It's called asset recycling. So this is an approach that enables government to basically to untie the capital, which is currently tied down in state-owned assets, infrastructure assets, that the government does not need to be involved anymore as a financier. So these are some of those assets that are already producing revenues, stable revenues. This asset can be offered to the private sector, and Africa 50 with our 28 government shareholders, we can help put together those transactions. Government could then raise capital by offering those assets as concessions, and then use those funds to fund new infrastructure program. Even some of the assets that today do not look good, they could be attractive. We today at Africa 50, for example, we are in the process of investing in an airport in Guinea-Conakry. And Prime Minister Silva is here, Cape Verde. I understand there could be some discussion on the airport in Cape Verde. We can figure out a way to take over those assets in exchange for funds given to government for government to fund the stimulus programs. Now, here's one important thing. In order to build resilience, we need to focus on domestic capital mobilization. Now, we need foreign global financing for sure, but we have $1.8 trillion of asset under management by insurance investors in Africa, actually, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, etc. Let's figure out a way to actually mobilize some of those assets. Again, asset recycling can be useful for these kind of investors because insurance investors, pension funds, they like assets which are producing cash flows. And I think that asset recycling is a kind of fresh thinking that we are talking about this with a number of African countries, the African Development Bank, with our chairman, Dr. Kimumi Adesina, they're supporting the idea. So I think that this is kind of things that at Africa 50 we are doing. We have a capital, we have some capital, not a lot, that we can put to work in infrastructure asset, but we need to figure out a way to mobilize more of this capital. So that's one of the messages that I wanted to convey. First, infrastructure is key, health for sure, water, sanitation, but also let's continue to do power. But secondly, I do support strongly the negotiation for restructuring of debt, debt moratorium, debt forgiveness. But let's also look at ways to mobilize our own domestic resources so that we are not perceived as always trying to get help from others without helping ourselves. We can do both in parallel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Alain. And as I said at the beginning, this is a conversation. So if you want to chime in, if you want to ask questions, please feel free to do so. Or if you want to challenge the other panelists' contributions, so feel free to do so. Mr. Alain, I can really tell that you're very passionate about infrastructure development. And I agree with you that this is something that we really need to continue to invest highly and make it a priority. And also now that we're going to effect the Africa Continental Free Trade and start trading among ourselves, I mean, a proper infrastructure has to be in place for this to be actualized. So, as you said, I totally agree with everything that you said, and we'll come back to you again. Kate, I see that you'd like to chime in. Please go ahead.
Thank you all so much. And Vivian, thank you. It's inspiring to see your leadership of this panel here this morning. You're doing a wonderful job, and I just want to congratulate you. I also want to thank you for including me in this amazing panel of people. I view it as our role here is to learn and absorb and then offer perspective less on what should the future of the African economy be. That's certainly not my role, but I really wanted to comment a little bit on something that everyone has touched upon, but we haven't quite yet focused in on, which is the role of digital technology to both help reach out to this, but also some of the challenges that it may be exacerbating about false information or correct information. So it both can provide the opportunity to reduce the fear of COVID-19, but it also in some ways accelerates some of the challenges about false rumors that come about. But I wanted to spend a little bit of time on how do we help enable some of the youth education, some of the healthcare services, and a lot of that is tied also to Alain's point about infrastructure. So not only do we need to make sure that there is sufficient capital available, but that there's sufficient investment in digital economy and digital transformation, something that all of your countries are actually working towards, but then that can actually unleash the services on top of it for health and for education. But so critical to that will be actually making sure that we can use that and access that, more people can access that at home. With only 18% of the African population being able to actually access the internet at home today, that's a significant divide. For Her Excellency Monica, so she talked about her children. I have twin 12-year-old boys. They can go to school because they have access to education at home. That is enabled by broadband infrastructure that's in place, as well as some of the applications that are placed on top of that. And I think we have to bring that also into this, because as we hit this reset button and actually look at it, everyone everywhere around the world is facing these same sets of challenges. And we have to all collaboratively work together to figure out which of these practices work, what isn't working, how do we learn from one another. And so I'm really interested in also hearing from you all about how your economies and your countries are actually tackling that, as well as your organizations, because I think if we can actually build back better everywhere, but really unleash the power of digital technology and learn in so many ways from what the African continent has already led on. Mobile money, digital infrastructure, cashless payments, a lot of focus on universal health coverage. Those are all things that other people can learn from. I can particularly say, based in the US, that's something that we could definitely learn from. So.
Thank you so much, Kate, for your contribution. And I think Dr. Mwangi will respond to some of the issues that you've raised. But before that, I have another question for Mr. Alain that you'll respond to after President Obasanjo speaks. So there's a question from the audience for you. In what ways do you see the diaspora playing a role in infrastructure improvement? And are there policies that allow for their involvement to be more seamless? And to His Excellency President Obasanjo, Her Excellency Mrs. Geingos spoke about collaboration, and we need more collaboration right now. So is there an opportunity for collaboration outside of Africa to address some of the issues that have been raised regarding the impact of COVID-19 on Africa's economy and looking at the future of Africa's economy? And if yes, who are the ideal partners, and what do African leaders look for in external partners?
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. I think the point that you have just raised, to me, touches at the heart of the theme of our discussion, which is regional response and economic recovery in Africa. You see, we are in a crisis, and it depends really very much how we see the crisis. If we see the crisis as sparks of coal fire spreading and touching each and every one of us, and our attention is, let me get rid of the coal of fire on me, and then everybody manages getting rid of his or her own coal of fire. Now, that will make us one by one get out of being burned. But after we have got out of being burned, what do we do? And I believe that the collective response seems not to have been paid sufficient attention, whether at the local level, at the community level, or at the local level, or at the national level, or at the sub-regional level of economic communities, or even at the continental level. At the continental level, let me start with that, which is the highest. We have the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, which should have come into effect. Now, because of COVID-19, it has come into effect. I believe COVID-19 should never have stopped the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement coming into effect. Because one of the things that will help us in recovering as fast as possible is trading. To trade more among ourselves, bilateral in Africa, multilateral sub-regionally, and multilateral continentally. We have a framework. Let us put that framework into action. We have the regional economic communities, which have been there. How can we make more use of them in our effort of responding to COVID-19 and in our effort of economic joint collaborative economic recovery? I believe that whatever we do at the national level should lead to something at the sub-regional level, and whatever we do at the sub-regional level should lead to something at the continental level. That is when we can say we have a regional response to COVID-19 and an economic recovery that is of a cooperative and collaborative nature. Let me take the two or three key issues. Education has been talked about, and I cannot underline that any more than those who have spoken about education. But you can only talk about education when you have been able to have food. So far, I think it's Tsitsi Masiyiwa who has laid sufficient emphasis, if I may say that, on food security. And during and immediate post COVID pandemic, one of the things that we will all face in Africa is food shortage. And let me take my own country, Nigeria. Because of what we have been going through in the area of security in different parts of our country, Boko Haram, banditry, kidnapping, and all that, people have not been able to produce in agriculture as they should have done. Now, with the COVID-19 restriction, in fact, agricultural production had been again more curtailed. And this year, we have parts of the country where rain has been less than what it should have been. So we will have shortage of food supply. How do we deal with that? How do we deal with it in terms of being able to produce enough availability? Now, if we are able to even have availability, how do we have accessibility for many people who have lost jobs and who have not been able to have sufficient means of livelihood? How do we deal with that? So the issue of food security becomes very, very serious and very critical, and requires attention, not only at the national level, not only at the sub-regional level, but at the continental level. And before now, we are spending about $40 billion that we shouldn't have spent on importation of food into Africa. Now with COVID-19, that amount that we may need to get ourselves food may have to be doubled. Now that requires not the attention of only one country. It requires the attention and the collective response of the continent, and may even be the global attention. Now let me talk about food, about employment. Some people will lose jobs permanently as a result of COVID-19. Those jobs that they have lost, particularly in transportation, in hospitality, may never come back. Or if they will come back at all, it will be 2 or 3 years after the pandemic has gone down. So what will they do in the meantime? What are we going to do to get employment? What are the low-hanging fruit for job creation, for employment provision for our youth and for our adults, for those who are vulnerable, people who have no people to provide for them. Now, I believe this brings me back to agribusiness. I believe the area of agriculture is one area where we can get millions of members of our population to get engaged, to get many gainfully employed in all the value chain of food and agribusiness, from equipment for land preparation along the value chain up to the food on the table. And this is one area where we can pay attention at every level, at the family level, at the community level, at the national, sub-regional, and regional level. And that is when we will be paying attention to regional response, which will give us an economic recovery that will really serve the purpose of Africa.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. You've raised some really great points on on addressing shortage of food supply, which is something that Dr. Tsitsi has also raised, and she actually showed us how she's doing it with the young people, young entrepreneurs in Zimbabwe, and also on the issue of agribusiness. So because of shortage of time, I would like to ask any other panelists who would like to chime in before I share the questions from the audience. I know I'd already sent one question to Mr. Alain. Her Excellency, please go ahead. Monica, sorry.
Monica, yes. I think I just want to mention something that we've only touched on but haven't spoken enough about, and that's trust. Trust of our governments, from the level of citizens to the private sector and the relationship between private sector and government. And I think one of the imperatives is rebuilding trust. When your population doesn't trust you, they don't trust what you say, and they don't listen to what you say. If the private sector doesn't trust that the resources that they assist with aren't going to be used honestly and effectively, it's a problem. So when we speak about effective governance, I think the key to that is building a trust process again between citizenry and governments, as well as between governments and private sector. And then the other point I just want to raise quickly, Vivian, so that we also don't, so that we do it justice, is, and it's a point made by Alain, and I agree with him about the infrastructure, but if COVID has taught us something, we must be careful of outsourcing public services to private entities. So I think to kind of agree and disagree with him is to say yes, investment in infrastructure, no to outsourcing and thinking that private sector will do a better job on its own without government, and yes to effective and well thought through public-private partnerships where private sector is directed by government, but government is also willing to listen to private sector about how to make sure that the impact is felt appropriately and where it's needed. So I want to stop there.
Vivian, can I just throw in something quickly?
Absolutely.
You know, this is the biggest crisis we've ever faced globally. Parents, children, grandparents. And I'm asking myself, how do we all get to work together and understand it's all hands on deck? That it's not the responsibility of the government or the private sector or philanthropy, that every single person has to contribute. How are we going to do that so that we create a sense of urgency to fix our problems as Africans and not think too much of external help because it's not coming?
Vivian,
if I can jump in there, Claire.
Yes, Claire.
On that issue of how do you put everybody together to do what they should be doing, I think the role of leadership in government is very important, because you need a convener. You need somebody who brings all these players together and ensure that we're actually working together. And I think the role of leadership, not only during the crisis, but also in building resilience, not to just fight the crisis, but also for the future. And for me, I think that the role of leadership, as we think about crisis, dealing with the crisis, we should not lose sight of many of the long-term visions that we have as a country, because those long-term visions have all these elements. They have education, they have infrastructure, they have technology. This is how many of our countries are planning to ensure that we build resilience for the future. But how do we make sure that our leadership is able to deal with the short term, but at the same time not lose sight of the long term, because the long term is where the resilience is coming, and that leadership is able to bring everybody on the table so that everybody does their part. So I just want to double click on leadership being a very effective component in this discussion.
Thank you so much, Claire.
Vivian, maybe I could come in because Madam Monica, since I cannot call it Excellency, I'll call it Madam. Madam Monica, you raised a very important...
just 1 minute before you go on. So after you, I'm just trying to make sure that we're in order here because of the time constraints. So after you, we have Dr. Mwangi. And Dr. Mwangi, there's a question for you from the audience, including the question from Kate on bridging the digital divide. So I want to ask Dr. Mwangi, what has been the effect on the small business owners in the economy, and how can they bounce back, and will they bounce back? So think of that as Mr. Alain contributes. So Mr. Alain, you have 2 minutes exactly.
All right, excellent, Vivian. Monica, I think I agree with you in some ways that, frankly, there's no point saying that the private sector can solve it all and government should stay out. Government has a very important role to play. In many of the projects that we've done, we have true public-private partnerships. For example, the airport project that we did in Guinea, the government has 1/3 of the shareholding, so the government has a void. Africa 50, which is actually owned by government also, but with a commercial mandate, also help understand a bit more government priorities when we implement this project. It's very important. I used to be at the World Bank Group. Sometimes we would advise that government should stay out of a number of things, but I think government has a role. At the end of the day, they're the most accountable to elections for what's happening in the country. If you take what we're doing in Rwanda, for example, with my sister Clare, Kigali Innovation City, a great project under the great leadership of His Excellency President Kagame, it's also a public-private partnership. Africa 50 is working together with Rwanda Development Board and the Ministry of ICT to put together the project, and so government priorities are taken into account. For the diaspora, I think that was a question that was asked to me. I think there are many ways the diaspora can come into infrastructure in Africa. First of all, as project developers, they can actually help develop some of the project, and we would be happy to look at ways in which we can finance them. Especially some projects which don't require a lot of capital, let's say in off-grid, mini-grid, ICT. I mean, we see a lot of things. What we need to do is to create an ecosystem that will allow them to actually thrive. And also, for the bigger project, we are thinking about maybe infrastructure bonds that we can actually issue, and then the diaspora can actually buy some of those bonds and then participate into the financing of the infrastructure. I know I have only 2 minutes, but I can talk a bit more about it, but I have to stop here.
Thank you so much. Dr. Mwangi, and then we'll have the Prime Minister from Cape Verde. He also wants to chime in on the discussion on infrastructure, but that's after Dr. Mwangi. Dr. Mwangi, you have 2 minutes.
Let me jump first to the issue of leadership. I think we need leadership that helps us not just to rebuild the African economy, but to build it better. We must build a more resilient, more inclusive African economy that doesn't leave anybody behind. As was earlier said by Her Excellency Monica, it is imperative to recognize that the worst of us has been exposed. And we can't rebuild African economies with that worst that has been exposed. 1, of lack of resilience. 2, of inequalities that really put a lot of the population under the bus. That must be addressed for sustainability. But jumping on the digital question, I think we have really to address the issue of digital inclusion and address the digital divide. Because if we look, online businesses did much better than what we were calling the place to go or the physical businesses. They were more responsive, they were more agile. And Africa is very well equipped to embrace digital inclusion. In the sense that if you look at innovations where value and opportunities will be created, particularly for young people, it is in that space. But what is really required is a deliberate policy focus, just to ensure that that becomes central focus in terms of resources and in terms of mindset. Our mindset must be framed in such a way we are not promoting traditional sectors which private sector resources have been relocated from. But let me answer the issue of small and micro businesses as has been asked by the audience. 1, that is the real central area that all of us should focus on, simply because if we don't rebuild our businesses, what we shall really do is to expose livelihoods. It will start moving from a health pandemic to a socio-human crisis, not just brought by unemployment, but exhibiting economic crisis because of purchasing power. SMEs or the informal sector employ almost 90% of the African employed population. So by failing in that sector, then what we'll be doing is again, not only destroying jobs, but destroying purchasing power and introducing humanitarian and social crises within the continent. And I don't think any of us wish to be there. Can SMEs be saved? I think there must be deliberate effort because of their importance to support them. Governments can work with the financial systems and banks and all other credit providers to ensure that the small and medium enterprises are given moratoriums in terms of loan repayment. Both interest and principal, they must be given breaks, because if they have not been operating, it means then they have lost the capacity to repay their loans. Government must provide credit guarantees that can support such credit extension and moratoriums, just to ensure that we don't move the crisis from the SMEs and put them to the banks. And then lastly, as Clare said, it is not just about the supply side. We must also address the demand side. We must either rebuild the global supply chains that are broken. Most of the SMEs have lost their markets. And that can be done in twofold. Either we now build a regional manufacturing capability based on the broken supply chains. We reduce our imports and give that. The government can also do stimulus packages that are geared towards giving a market to the SMEs, just purely for them to bounce back, such that and we can do that dealing with health or education, because they are priority. Transforming agriculture, can we do that using our SME so that we first of all create the market for them? And lastly, the civil society, development institution, foundations, we must all team together to build the capacity of our SMEs so that they enhance their capacity, particularly in terms of quality, so that they become more globally competitive and they become really the champions, national champions and regional champions in manufacturing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mwangi, for that passionate response. Next is the Prime Minister of Cape Verde, and I know, Your Excellency, you want to respond to the issue on infrastructure, but I would also like you to tie on, Dr. Mwangi has really spoken about building our resilience. So how can resilience measures be integrated into future economic development planning? And then after that, we have Ms. Kate. And Your Excellency, you have 2 minutes, please.
I'd like to add something. I think immediately we have to do a good fight of COVID-19 in terms of save lives, protect jobs, create all the conditions for our population. In medium long term, we need African countries, and I talk about the Cape Verde, or experience to finance the structural transformation, to be more resilient, to create all the conditions to improve the quality of life of our population. It's need to mobilize the resource. When we talk about debt forgiveness, it's to finance extraordinary, exceptional costs that is provided by the COVID-19. But we need to mobilize national resource, and the national resources are not just financial resource. Good governance, it's a national resource. Leaderships, good leaderships, it's a national resource. Access to education, improving capacity building for our young people, it's a national resource. And when you talk about national resource, we talk about the diaspora. Cabo Verde is a country that have a very large diaspora around the world. The diaspora have a good contribution for the economy. In this pandemic, it was an element very important to promote good collaboration with the families in Cabo Verde. But we talk about foreign investment. We need national investment for the entrepreneurs, partnership between public sector and private sector to create more capacity to resolve the problem in terms of immediately short-term, medium, and long-term that we need to do the good transformation. In Cabo Verde, we have our 2030 strategic agenda for sustainable development in place. With this agenda, we want to position Cabo Verde as first of all, a safe and clean country, because the tourism is very important for this country, and we need to relaunch the tourism with confidence to position Cabo Verde as a platform for digital services in Africa. The digital economy is very, very important, and this moment is increasing this importance. A country less dependent upon fossil fuels. We plan to be 50% renewable by 2030 and 100% by 2040. We need to be a country less dependent upon rainfall thanks to widespread of use of water desalination and renewable energy in agriculture, very important sector. We are working to be a leader of the blue economy. We have more sea than land in Cabo Verde. A blue economy that marshals our ocean resource in the most sustainable ways possible. And a sustainable tourism destination. A green and blue tourism. Because it's the most important sector activities, economic activity in Cabo Verde. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. Now to Kate, you have exactly 1 minute. And then any other panelists, you have 30 seconds. So just let me know.
I was reflecting on what people have said and really thinking about, this is a complex and interwoven set of problems and challenges, from food to agriculture to youth unemployment to how do we actually bring everyone in and count everyone? We view digital technology as being a key tool to make that happen, but I think it's really what Claire and others have highlighted about the degree and role of leadership and the degree and role of financing that makes that possible, and building, as Her Excellency Monica said, really rebuilding trust, that excellent public-private partnerships can actually be put in place. Speaking on behalf of those working in sort of like more of the global community side of it and looking at sort of what are different models of digital economy and digital transformation, say there's deep commitment to the fact that this is actually driven by countries and for countries, and that we are to be of service to you. So I think that one thing that has gotten much better in the last 20 or 30 years is that belief that there is no longer something that is imposed from outside, but rather instead supported from within. And so even though I know that the feeling may be that it's only can be driven internally, and I think it absolutely has to be driven internally, but I would say that on behalf of those who work on sort of the global side, that we're very much standing here to try and support some of the transformation and ambitions that you yourselves have actually faced, because this is, back to His Excellency's comments, this is a collective and collaborative problem, and that we all face this as human beings, wherever we happen to be placed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate. Alain?
I'd like to say just quickly, I suppose it's a conclusion on my side, is that we should rightly spend a lot of time trying to mobilize capital globally from global investors, but we should spend as much time to try to mobilize capital regionally from regional domestic investors, because it's less volatile. I'm not saying don't go global, but I think we need to spend a bit more time to think about it, because if many of our insurance investors' capital is getting invested globally, but we have good investment opportunities here. We have to make sure that they're safe enough to make sure that those investors, regional investors, local investors can also participate. That's an important point I'd like to leave, especially for our leaders.
Thank you so much. Any other person? 15 seconds, 30 seconds.
It's going to be
Vivian, maybe just to conclude. Sorry, Your Excellency, please go ahead.
But maybe mine is quick, because it's a bit of a question to Kate when it comes to digital technology and solutions, and it's a question around inclusivity, because we live in a country where there's two economies. There's one economy where children go to fantastic private schools. They've got the full spectrum ICT infrastructure, and it's not a problem for them to utilize digital solutions. But the majority of the population is not there, both in terms of pricing, access, or access and affordability. So I agree with digital innovation, but how do we put equity into that conversation?
Okay, and then Claire to close up for us.
Yes, thank you. So I want to also conclude with the importance of having flagship ecosystem projects that are transformational. And for us in Rwanda, we've picked very specific projects that are beyond COVID-19, we think will create resilience. And I think having deliberate projects that don't just support one size of investors, but an ecosystem from SMEs to researchers to investors, etc. So the Kigali Innovation City project is one of them that Alain talked about, which is really the ecosystem for innovation, for young entrepreneurs, for big investors, for the Cisco, IBMs of this world, but also young Rwandans who have ideas that they want to take to the marketplace. The second one for us is the Kigali International Financial Center, and Mr. Mwangi knows about that because he's in the sector. Is really attracting and developing an ecosystem for both domestic mobilization, but also international mobilization, and creating that ecosystem. And then in agriculture, we have something called the Gabiro Agro Farm. Really, again, infrastructure with huge irrigation, thousands of hectares to bring the farmer closer to the market. So this concept of having ecosystem flagship projects that support building resilience, I think every country must emphasize and not lose sight of developing these flagship projects.
Thank you so much, Claire. Kate, are you able to respond to Monica in 30 seconds? Because we have to wrap up our session.
I think it is definitely more than a 30-second conversation, so I welcome following up on it. I would say shortly, I do think it's the combination first of the infrastructure in place, and there's a tremendous amount coming both out of the African Development Bank as well as the World Bank, as well as domestic capital that's being mobilized around that, as well as mobile network operators. And then I think on top of it, it's the inclusivity actually of starting with certain building blocks, digital ID, mobile payments, which most of your economies have moved to in some way, shape, or form, but emphasizing that. And then actually unleashing an infrastructure on which young entrepreneurs and SMEs can actually build upon, so that they're actually building the apps themselves within the local economy versus them being imposed from outside by different countries, because that's where the innovation can happen. And I think that's also a place to look at for future of youth and unemployment. And there's a number of economies and countries around the world who are not Western groups who have done this in a very interesting and different model. So it is not something that has to be done in as expensive or big a way as has always been portrayed. But I'd love to continue this conversation further with those who are interested. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate. And Monica is very active on her Twitter, so you can also send her lengthy response on her Twitter, and her email address is also there, so you can also email her office directly. But now I'd like to end our conversation for today. Thank you so much for this energetic, passionate discussion. I wish we had the whole day to continue. But we have the Concordia Africa Summit again coming up on the 16th and the 17th of November through the partnership with the Rwandan Development Board. I hope we can continue deliberating even outside of the conference. I hope we can forge synergies because this is one of the reasons why we have the Concordia platform, to forge synergies, to figure out how to work together as we continue building a resilient Africa that works for all of us. So thank you again for joining us today.